The killings stopped, the shooter was captured alive, and the case was declared closed, yet critical evidence was never tested. Key decisions were never fully explained, and some conclusions were accepted far faster than they were proven. What happened here reshaped a nation's laws almost overnight, but it also locked in an official narrative so quickly that uncomfortable questions were pushed aside. Those questions still exist, they were never answered, and they matter. The people who died that day were not connected by ideology, politics, or conflict. They were connected by routine: tourists following maps, families sharing meals, workers doing ordinary jobs in a public historic site designed for open access, not security. None of them were protected by barriers, armed guards, or warning systems. There was no credible threat assessment in place, no prior alerts, no expectation that violence on this scale could occur there. Several victims were elderly couples traveling together. Others were parents with children. Some were staff members who had worked the site for years and knew its layout intimately. That familiarity became a liability. The design encouraged free movement between buildings, open sightlines, and minimal separation between visitors and service areas. No one was trained to respond to a mass casualty event. There was no coordinated emergency protocol beyond basic first aid and calling police. Survivors later described confusion rather than panic during the initial moments. Loud noises were misinterpreted as construction or fireworks. By the time people understood what was happening, escape routes were already compromised. Many victims were struck at close range, some while attempting to flee, others while hiding in areas that offered no meaningful cover. The attacker moved with speed and purpose. He exploited the openness of the site, transitioning between locations without immediate resistance. The weapon used was a semi-automatic rifle capable of rapid fire, paired with high-capacity magazines. This combination allowed sustained shooting without frequent pauses. The lack of armed security meant there was no immediate challenge to his movements. Emergency calls began flooding in, but information reaching authorities was fragmented. Early reports conflicted about the number of shooters, their locations, and the nature of the threat. This uncertainty delayed a coordinated response. Local police were not equipped for an active shooter situation of this scale. Specialized units were located hours away. As the attack progressed, the shooter left the main site and continued killing elsewhere. Vehicles were hijacked. A hostage situation developed. The violence was no longer confined to one location, complicating containment efforts. Police established perimeters based on incomplete intelligence, allowing further movement before the suspect was fully isolated. When the standoff finally ended, the attacker was alive. He had sustained no gunshot wounds. He was arrested without being fired upon. From a law enforcement perspective, this allowed interrogation and prosecution. From an investigative perspective, it also meant that nearly all explanations for motive, planning, and execution would come from one source: the perpetrator himself. The crime scene spanned multiple locations, some unsecured for extended periods. Evidence was trampled, moved, or exposed before forensic teams arrived. Witness statements were taken under extreme stress, often days later, when memory distortion is most severe. Initial timelines were revised repeatedly as new information emerged, creating discrepancies that were never fully reconciled. Ballistics analysis linked recovered cartridge casings to the rifle attributed to the accused, but questions remained about the total number of shots fired and whether all fatal rounds could be conclusively traced. Some autopsies indicated trajectories that raised questions about shooter, position, and movement. These findings were noted, but not aggressively pursued. The suspect's background became central to the narrative. He was portrayed as a lone actor with a history of intellectual impairment and social isolation. Psychological evaluations varied. Some experts described him having significant cognitive limitations. Others argued he demonstrated planning capacity inconsistent with the simplistic profile presented publicly. His confession became a cornerstone of the case, yet the circumstances under which it was obtained raised concerns. He initially denied involvement, then confessed after prolonged detention and interrogation. Portions of his statements were inconsistent with physical evidence. Some details appeared to change over time, aligning more closely with publicly reported facts than with independent recollection. Notably, the accused refused to testify in court. This meant his account was never subjected to cross-examination. The trial proceeded without a jury, relying heavily on written evidence, expert reports, and admissions. The legal process prioritized certainty and closure over adversarial testing of the prosecution's narrative. Alternative suspects were publicly dismissed early. Reports of additional gunmen were attributed to confusion and stress. Witnesses who claimed to see multiple attackers were told their memories were unreliable. Yet some of these accounts came from trained observers, including military personnel and law enforcement officers present as civilians. Their statements were not reconciled with the official version. They were excluded from it. Questions also arose about the logistics of the attack. The speed at which the shooter moved, reloaded, and targeted raised doubts among firearms experts. Some argued that the volume of fire and casualty counts within the given time frame would be difficult for a single individual to achieve without assistance or extraordinary proficiency. These concerns were acknowledged but never formally investigated. Media coverage intensified public pressure. Graphic details dominated headlines. The demand for answers was immediate and overwhelming. Political leaders moved quickly to promise action. Within weeks, sweeping gun control measures were introduced and passed with rare bipartisan support. Certain firearms were banned outright. A national buyback program was launched. Ownership requirements were tightened dramatically. These reforms were effective in reducing mass shooting incidents in the years that followed. From a policy perspective, the outcome was clear. From an investigative perspective, the urgency to implement change may have curtailed deeper examination of unresolved issues. Once the reforms were in place, public appetite for further scrutiny diminished. The families of victims were offered compensation and counseling. Memorials were established. The site was redesigned to remove certain structures and alter visitor flow. These actions acknowledged loss, but did not address lingering doubts. Some families privately questioned aspects of the official account, while others accepted it as necessary for healing. The perpetrator received multiple life sentences with no possibility of release. He was placed in long-term solitary confinement. Over time, reports emerged about his mental state deteriorating further. Any potential for new testimony, clarification, or challenge to the narrative effectively disappeared. Years later, independent researchers and journalists revisited the case. They found missing records, sealed documents, and evidence that had been destroyed according to standard retention policies. Requests for transparency were often denied on grounds of national interest or victim protection. The passage of time hardened these barriers. The central unresolved question remains whether the crime was fully understood before it was finalized. In the public record, was the investigation exhaustive, or was it sufficient? Were anomalies dismissed because they threatened a narrative that served an urgent social purpose? And if so, does that undermine the truth? Even if the outcome produced positive change, this was not a mystery in the traditional sense. The violence was visible, documented, and undeniable. But understanding how it happened, why it unfolded the way it did, and whether all responsible factors were identified is a different matter. Closure was declared, but certainty was assumed. What remains is a case where the official explanation answers the largest question, who, while leaving smaller, sharper questions untouched. Questions about process, about evidence, about whether speed replaced scrutiny,